Welcome to the first reading of the Nei Jing Tu. This diagram or scroll called the Nei Jing Tu, which translates roughly into the map of the internal pathways or the inner landscape of your energetic experience or energetic capacity. This document goes back in some form about 500 years, although the one we're looking at now comes from a fairly modernized one that's about 150 years old. This scroll offers people who are learning meditation three opportunities. The first opportunity is a process of interacting with your awareness and your body and your breath in a way that invites you into a deep and immersive and fairly complete meditation practice and experience. Second, this scroll also speaks to the more spiritual, ethical, affirmational aspects of meditation and spiritual cultivation that help us arrive in a more Buddhist orientation to enlightenment or to compassion, loving kindness, and an awakening that has a lot more to do with our sense of being a being within this shared experience of the world. The third opportunity that's presented in this scroll has to do with a more traditional Taoist understanding of meditation, which has more to do with unconditioning our experience as beings, perhaps removing some of the patterns that we learn from our parents, our cultures, our relationships, our teachers, and other things, so that when we become consciousness, observing consciousness, there isn't much in the way, there isn't opinions about what should or shouldn't be going on. And in its essence, you could say, Taoist meditation is an invitation to experience the unborn mind, or the origin of consciousness itself. So perhaps unlike the Buddhist approach, which has more to do with an ethical understanding of what enlightenment might bring about, the experience in the Taoist practice is much farther behind in any sense of ethics or purpose, because I suppose the assumption would be consciousness knows itself, knows what it needs to be doing and how and why. It doesn't need an ism to wrap itself up in. Another way that I like to look at this document is as a kind of spiritual treasure map. And imagine that you've been given a treasure map by someone who knows that you know kind of the terrain that you're getting into, or the landscape that you're getting into, and that with this treasure map you can move through your internal landscape, your embodied experience, and discover and perhaps refine certain things to produce a very beneficial outcome, hence the idea of the treasure map. Now, the reason I bring this up is this is not a treasure map for anyone. Anyone can look at this, but the assumption with the Nei Jing Tu, this map of the inner landscape of our energetic experience and reality, assumes that 1, you have a practice. 2, you have a practice that exists within a tradition that understands the progress and the processes and the challenges that you're going to interact as you go through your traditional training. And it also assumes that you have a teacher. And the reason I say that is that, as you may or may not know, a lot of Taoist documents and language and use of terminology is, you could say, a kind of shorthand, and in some ways a little bit kind of like a secret code language or way of communicating, so that when a person is given this treasure map or this scroll of opportunities, you can work with your teacher to understand the terminology better, perhaps work with where you as an individual may find the most challenges and opportunities. So again, without a practice that's consistent, without a tradition that has progress and process that you can follow, and a teacher that you can interact with, this document and everything that I'm going to be speaking about would be interesting maybe from kind of an archaeological, anthropological, spiritual, historical point of view, but it's not going to be tangibly as effective. Before going into the translation, I thought it would be good to just introduce myself so we have a sense of where I'm coming from in sharing this with you. My name is Dr. Michael Smith, and I've been a formal student of Taoist practice for about 37 years and became a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine about 30 years ago. I had the good fortune of studying in the Yidao Huanyuan tradition of Xu Dao, or of Taoist practice and traditional Chinese medicine. And that tradition is unique in that it focuses on Taoist practice as it relates to healing, at least at first, before it really focuses on spiritual cultivation or anything existential or esoteric. Something that is unique about the Yi Dao Huanyuan tradition, which translates as returning to the source through the practice of medicine, is that it is a Taoist village tradition. It comes from the Lintou village in southern China. It's been in its present form for about 400 years, and for about 1,000 years before that it was more in the Shangqing tradition of Taoist practice. In this lineage, because it's a tradition that focuses on healing and healing other people, but also healing ourselves, the interpretation of the classics, the interpretation of, say, this document here, is naturally going to be skewed a little bit towards the opportunities for us as human beings to not only be healthy with respect to our organs and nerves and muscles and bones and things like that, but healthy in the context of, you could say, who is the one meditating, how it is that we approach our practice, how it is that we perhaps project our assumptions onto the outcome of what we're doing and why. And that changes some aspects of perhaps how this is interpreted. I'll be translating it more or less word for word throughout the next 3 readings. But for today, I'll just be going through the more standard translation using the most common terms that this translates into, which comes from a scholar, Louis Komiazi, who's a PhD in Taoist studies and a very well-known author and teacher. So much respect to Louis for that. And the reason I'm using his translation at first is because translating some of these terms into English is a tricky thing to do for anyone, but it makes sense to me at the beginning of this to use terminology that you might be familiar with, because when I translated the second time, I'm going to be using terminology that I would use with my students, as you'll see if you watch the second video. As well, I've been studying Qigong, martial arts, and meditation for about 45 years, and I just have a very profound personal interest in the nature of consciousness and what experience and the mysteries of experience may hold for us in our practice. I offer a 200-hour Qigong teacher training program, and once people have finished that, they can go for an additional 350-hour professional Qigong consultant program, and after that there's a 500-hour medical Qigong therapist program. So if you're interested in those, you can check them out in the link that you'll see on the screen here or in the description or comments below this video. So I would say there's 2 things to consider before we go into the actual translation. This document, more than anything, gives us perspective and a practical, practicable relationship with your 3 dantian. So your lower dantian is from your diaphragm down to your perineal floor. Your middle dantian is from your diaphragm to your larynx and basically the bottom of where you swallow and everything that's going on in that space. And then everything above that is your upper dantian. And you can take this from the physical, sections of the body as a beginning of the 3 dantian, but there's also aspects of consciousness, aspects of instinct, aspects of physiology that you're also going to be working with, interacting with, perhaps limited by and or needing to rejuvenate in each of these 3 areas. So you could say the lower dantian is much more about the animal, instinctual, raw, what I often refer to as the kind of gur and pur mojo qualities of life, which can be sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, sometimes impatient, sometimes very stuck. Middle dantian has so much to do with the mind in the sense of thought and feeling, perception, perspective, where we may carry a lot of personal woundedness or egoic, perspectives on maybe how powerful or special we should be, are, or things like that. So a lot of the cultivation in these areas are specific to resolving those aspects of our experience. And up here, this is much more the existential, spiritual, esoteric aspects of practice. The assumption or the guidance would be that you're working on them all simultaneously, but you also want to be going through them kind of over and over again, from the top down, from the bottom up, depending on what you're working with, so that as you come into balance, you keep reassessing the process of coming into balance, and this is always fun to put out there, as you grow and learn to unlearn, especially certain conditioned things, or let go of certain egoic things, the one practicing and the one guiding the practice, the one you or I, perhaps changing certain assumptions about what our practice is about and maybe what this document means, is going to keep changing. So that's why the assumption is that you're going to keep going through these practices in different ways as you change. So the practice changes you, but the changes in you change the practice. Another aspect of this document that's very clear that is fundamental to Taoist practice is noticing all of the specific changes in how we relate to our body, and to reassess and perhaps you could say heal in a way, or restore in a way, certain things that are considered to be narrow passes on the journey of your practice. Kind of like a rope bridge between two mountain peaks, and getting across there is possible, but it's not as easy. There may be boundaries there, and this is more of a European thing, but I think of the rope bridge going across, and some kind of troll or demon, or perhaps some part of your personal past that's actually holding you from moving through that aspect of your experience freely and openly. And we call these sanquan, or the three narrow passes, or really big challenges that we face. So there's the three classic ones that I'll get into in more detail. But having said that, there's many, depending on your past, your physical health, and perhaps even injuries along the back of the body, along the front of the body, and deep within the body. Say, a good example for us all is that place that we all have butterflies in our stomach. So depending on perhaps how anxious or how urgent or how afraid you may be about any aspect of your life, that's going to impact the way you trust yourself and the world, and how easy it may be or may not be to let certain things go, let certain things through. And that's why they're called passes, because we want to move through them. You just can't move against them, because that would kind of like be, I don't know, I'm getting like a grenade or something going off instead of a stream running through a beautiful mountain vista. So in the way that I was taught and have been taught over the last 30 years or so, and the way I've come to teach, I usually use three different readings of this document, and this will be the first reading. The first reading is always done left to right, because we want to look at these large sections of information and descriptions of what's going on. It gives us a wider context, and it also allows us to kind of move through these three dantian in a way that doesn't have an expectation about doing a lot. It's much more about what is this, why is it here, how is it going to help you or I in our practice. The second reading is usually done from the top down. And I mean that almost literally, from character by character, from the top down. And when I translate it for the second time, we want to focus on understanding, what is this document? Why is it set up the way that it is? What are we being invited to experience? And what kind of practices are we being invited to apply 3, 5, 10, maybe 30 years of our lives to? So when we go through that second reading from the top down, we really want to understand the Nei Jing Tu, this map of your inner pathways, the inner landscape of your experience, so that you have something, again, like this treasure map, that you can follow very, very clearly and coherently, because, and this is perhaps a strange thing to say out loud, some things are kind of life or death in the sense of their consequence, and if you're going to apply yourself for a decade or so to your spiritual cultivation and perhaps coherent realization or enlightenment in some way, it's probably a good idea that you're very certain that this process is the one you're going to choose to apply yourself to. The final reading is actually going to be a 6-part course on Xiu Dao and building foundation in preparation for either Nei Dan, or inner alchemic work, or Tian Tai, or the celestial embryo work, which is more the tradition that I teach. Either way, though, as we go through that building foundation process, we're going to retranslate and relearn this document in a slightly more practical way with a lot of practices, exercises, and principles as we go from the bottom up to build our foundation, to reorient ourselves and restore ourselves in the places that we are going to face the most challenges. And that's why that last reading is going to be a 6-part course, so that we can spend some time on each of these dantian, work our way through each of these passes in a way that's very patient, very practical, and also kind of carries the assumption that we're working on this simultaneously, and this is kind of a Taoist thing. The place we're going to is a return to something that we already are. We're not aspiring like climbing a ladder to the sky, in the sense of there's some place we are stuck and then there's some better place over there. It's more about getting the obstructions out of the way so that we can experience what our true, authentic, original experience might be all of the time. And depending on your background, that may or may not ring true with your experience. So the last thing I'm going to say about this is a challenge for contemporary people in studying these ancient documents is that quite a bit of it is intermingled with cultural awareness and understanding. Say, for example, a couple of the characters here, this young lad here and this weaving girl here. There's a cultural story where they're, the unrequited lovers who can only spend one night a year together at just the right time, and all of these other things. So just as an example, there's implicit parts of this document that if you're not well-read about Chinese culture and their underlying kind of symbolic meaning, you're left with taking them literally in a Western context, and believe me, that can get you into all kinds of really funny places that you really don't want to spend a lot of time, because we are actually wanting to practice this and take it into a very practical process so we can develop progress. So when we play with this document and talk about it, what I'm going to do occasionally is use the paradigm that was presented in a series of movies. The first one was called The Matrix. And that way we can look at some of the cultural metaphor from China and then parallel it to something we can all agree is sort of perhaps fans of a movie. That there's symbolism within, culture and films and stories. And as long as we can use the cultural symbols malleably to help us understand the experiential part and the existential part and what's being suggested here, then we're going to move ahead with a sense of confidence and understanding, in a sense of instead of perhaps using kind of strange terminology and cultural symbolism that may not actually be something that's really a part of your experience or a part of your sense of meaning, and that's very important. So here's a quick example of that. In the movie The Matrix, there's this paradigm that's laid out in which the world most people are living in is kind of a little bit of a virtual reality, if you will, and it's kind of fake in a way, but behind that in some way, and if you've never seen the movie, I don't want to wreck it for you, but behind that reality in some way is the real world, the real understanding, and perhaps some kind of truth. And that's very true to Taoist thought and understanding of practice, in that we have the born, conditioned, inculcated mind, and then we have the unborn, the original, the untainted, pure mind. And they're not obviously the same, but you can't have one without the other. So sometimes I'll be using cultural symbolism, and sometimes I'll be referring to things like movies to help us parallel the Chinese cultural symbolism with something that's more contemporary. So I hope that's helpful. So here we are, we're going to begin the first reading, and we're going to start from left to right. We're going to begin with this. So this part of the document describes the person who, you could say, found this and decided to create a way for it to be published and printed for many people to see. So let's get into what this part of the document says. So as you may or may not know, Older Chinese is written from the top right downwards and then moving left. This diagram has never been transmitted before. The fundamental reason for this is because the way of the elixir, or Nei Tan, is vast and subtle. there are obtuse people who do not have the ability to grasp it. Consequently, it rarely has been transmitted in the world. I happened to observe the diagram among the books and paintings in the study of a Taoist monastery, and by chance it was hanging on a wall. The skill used in its painting technique is finely executed. The annotations of the joints and articulations, meridians and vessels are clearly distinguished, and each one contains specific cavities or places to gather your resources. I examined the inner landscape for a long time and realized that my practice and skills were growing. I began to realize that exhalation and inhalation, as well as expelling and ingesting, what's called Hu Xi Tu Na, which is the original practices of Qigong in China. I began to realize that the exhalation and inhalation, as well as the expelling and ingesting of the human body, are the waxing and waning, as well as the ebb and flow of the universe. It can be divine and gain. If you can divine and gain insight into this, you will have progressed more than halfway on your inquiry into the great way of the golden elixir, or Taoist alchemy. In truth, I did not dare to keep this for myself alone. Therefore, I had it engraved on a printing block so that it might be widely disseminated. It is published by the Mingshan bookstore. This second part of the document here is about the simultaneous relationships, and when we go through the rest of it, you'll notice that everything in here is actually happening somewhere else, and is describing why, the reason why I call this simultaneous interactions or simultaneous relationships is because they're happening everywhere at once. So in your practice, you're not just practicing one thing, you're practicing a series of things together. So let's translate this. The iron ox plows the field where golden coins are sown. Engraving the stone, the young lad holds a string of cash. A single grain of millet contains the entire world. Mountains and streams are decocted in a half-shung cauldron. The eyebrows of white-headed Lao Tzu hang down to the earth. The blue-eyed foreign monk Bodhidharma holds up the heavens. Orient yourself to the mysterious, and it is realized. Outside of this mystery, there is no other mystery. So down here by this ox and this water wheel is a description of the process. Repeatedly, constantly, the infinite mystery treadmill is pedaled in cycles. When the mechanism revolves, the water flows eastward or upward. The water, 10,000 fathoms deep, is seen straight to its bottom. A sweet spring bubbles up, rising to the summit of the southern mountain. So before I move up to here, I just want to speak quickly to the importance of this idea of the infinite kind of flux of yin and yang of this water wheel, and of the turning process of time of cultivation. And you might call it kind of like the pendulum of our experience with respect to yin and yang on many, many, many levels. Another thing that's important to consider is this idea of the water flowing eastward. And this has a lot to do with opening your lower gates, sealing the leakage of Jing or essence, given your lifestyle and any other aspects of how you live, in such a way that your Jing can be consolidated and the energy and material moving up and down through the spine is more refined. So if we can cultivate yin and yang, we can reverse the leakage and refine the flow of material and energy moving through the body, then we have a chance to work with our actual dantian. Now it's written here with respect to the relationship of the 5 phases and yin and yang as they intermingle and go from what you might call the mundane to the sacred. I don't mean to challenge anyone's personal understanding, but the concept of dantian can either be seen as a location or a relationship, and in this document it's described on several levels as different relationships. So the place is always going to be a little different depending on the relationship you're working with. As we move up into the middle dantian, and we're talking a bit more about the actual practice, this starts with, I am properly and attentively cultivating my own field. Inside there are numerous sprouts that live for 10,000 years. The flowers resemble yellow gold, their colors not uncommon. The seeds are like jade green, their fruits perfectly round. Cultivation completely depends on the earth of this central palace. Irrigation necessarily relies on the spring of the upper valley. The practice is completed suddenly, and I attain the great Tao. I wander carefree over the land, and water as an immortal of Peng Lai. So very quickly, that's, again, cultural terminology, and the island of Peng Lai is kind of like, you could say, a Taoist version of Valhalla. It's sort of the place the immortals go, and it's, perfect in every imaginable way in that context. And since we're speaking to the middle dantian, just quickly about what's happening in here. There are some descriptions of the spiritual nature and symbolism around your internal organs, which I'll talk about much later. Having said that, though, there is this context in the middle dantian that has a lot to do with state. And again, this is about your mind. So one state we try and cultivate is called true soil, or Chun Tu. And that is kind of a transition between dealing with how you experience your life and changing fundamentally the way you approach experiencing your life. One is kind of like sitting in the back seat of the car. The other one, you could say your hand is on the steering wheel. So that's a big part of our initiation and the first parts of our practice. And that, again, has a lot to do with how we approach our emotional life, our mental life, and also very much how the physiological aspects of our practice and our self-cultivation and our lifestyle may impact or limit our practice. So a couple of other components of the middle dantian that I'll speak to quickly in this first video have to do with the cow herding boy, or the ox herding boy, and the weaving girl. And as I had mentioned, there's a lot of cultural symbolism going on between those two. What is written in the Nei Jing Tu in this scroll has to do with, the cow herding boy is sitting in this spiraled walkway, so he's moving towards the center in this downpouring, if not profuse amount of blood around the heart, or kind of torrents of blood around the heart, if you will, which has some inherent symbolism. And the herd boy here is looking into the sky, and I'll speak to what that means in the next video. And there's a constellation in the sky that he's looking at and recognizing. And it also describes how the herd boy is engraving a stone to create a string of cash. And both of those things are kind of code words for different aspects of practice and where practice needs to be, but also where we can get lost. And there's sort of a lot of detail in there. But a lot of insight about where our heart and mind need to be centered, and where things can get a bit far afield. And then down here with the weaving girl, it describes how she is, in a way, creating, but also responsible for how things move throughout the body, but also within the body and within all of the different systems of the body. And although I won't speak to the details, there is a description and discussion of the spiritual names or nicknames and attributes of the 5 main organs plus your gallbladder, which is considered to be an extraordinary organ. In the sense of spiritual potential or capacities and responsibilities. So her work as the weaving girl, moving things around within the system of the body, maintains that balance, kind of in the way that you might think of a member at a big family feast, and one person is always the ambassador and everybody else might be, in conflict or something. There's also the symbolism of where she's sitting at the diaphragm next to a bunch of trees, which relate to the energy of wood or plant growth, the liver, and how between the kidneys, the liver, and the heart, from an emotional intelligence point of view, there's a really fine balance that's necessary. The diaphragm is implicit, obviously, in breath work and the many different aspects of breath work in Qigong, Neigong, Neitan practice. It's also right next to one of those narrow passes, or the Sanguan, or the places in the body or mind-body where a little bit of extra time and attention is always going to be needed. There's also the symbolism that, as a weaver girl, the warp and weft of the universe, of the fabric of space-time, or the meridian system of the body, or anything that you might want to imagine that has to do with a lot of threads interacting, also fall into the regulation and the cultivation in this area of the body. And then there's some other symbolism with that has to do with the kind of web of life and karma, ancestral things, which, I would say are relevant to us all, but are especially relevant in Chinese culture. So that hopefully gives you a pretty good sense of how to relate to what's being described in the middle dantian. And finally, before moving on, there are a couple of comments in here that are very much embedded in Taoist kind of code language or a specific way of speaking, so that when it's translated into mundane speech, some of these things can sound very abstract, but when you understand the symbolic meaning and what they're implying, if I was to sort of allude to that a little bit, again with the matrix metaphor, there's something that has to do with this boundary between the contrived conditioned world and the unconditioned unborn world of consciousness, and that there's going to be a period of time where we're kind of one foot in both, and that's actually a necessary thing to actually seek for a period of time. So when we move up into the upper dantian, which again has a lot to do with the existential aspects of practice and perhaps the spiritual opportunities and outcomes and the experiences we're going to have there, we can look at these two statements, which have a lot to do with the Buddhist approach to meditation. The first one says, Fatsang says, as a quote, "Violet eyes clarify the four great oceans. The white light pervades Mount Meru, or the center of the world." The second one here says, Tzi Shi, which is a kind of Buddhist incarnation or aspiration. It says, or Tzi Shi says, "Between the eyebrows, white light constantly emanates. This can liberate all sentient beings from the suffering of ceaseless reincarnations." Just above that, this drawing here of Lao Tzu, the kind of earliest Taoist sage that we all recognize and celebrate, has three statements here. The first one says, "Eyebrows of white-headed Lao Tzu hanging down to earth. If you orient yourself towards the mysterious will be attained, and outside of this mystery, there is no other mystery." So when we just quickly look at what's going on above the head, there are some things that have to do with our highest spiritual aspirations. There are some statements that encourage you to understand certain sacred truths about this practice. They're not truths in the sense that we all have to believe that they're true or decide that they're true or just take them on. They're just things that are alluded to in that cultural context about why meditation to this degree might be, very, very valuable to you. There's a description of kind of how long this can take, the states of being that you're going to want to cultivate, the quality of your posture, the changes in the shape and structure, especially of the back of the neck, the way that you use your tongue to produce and swallow saliva, the way that your ego, from the way you use your voice and face and facial expressions, maybe conscious or unconscious or conditioned or, passive-aggressive and manipulative or very authentic. And we're invited to reorient ourselves as our practice grows to a less rehearsed and contrived sense of self, to something very, very in the moment, and you could say trusting vastly in the nature of existence itself. There's also a connection between the way that we engage in practice above the throat, and then what's happening between the throat and the diaphragm, through the rib cage, through the heart, through the lungs, and again through the way we constrain and contain, or perhaps collapse sometimes around a lot of emotion or distress or trauma. So a lot is happening in there. So I hope that gives you a general sense of what the Nei Jing Tu is inviting you to do, to cultivate a practice, so hopefully within a tradition, hopefully with a teacher, to attend to the tangible relationships you experience in the three dantian, to be very patient and conscious that there are natural obstructions or obstacles within the way our conscious evolution and growth develops, and how that's very much anchored in the way you embody your experience. So we want to work on those mystical narrow passes that can sometimes slow things down or get in the way. And of course, the guidance that is contained in this document about the nature and the experience you're going to have as you cultivate a much more evolved and consistent and traditional relationship with what are called dantian, or the three dantian of this practice. So again, I hope that's helping you with understanding this document and inspiring you a little bit about perhaps finding a way to study Taoist meditation in a more formal and consistent way. I wish you well.